CNN's Angus Watson joins me now. Angus, hello to you. Tell us more about the reaction you're hearing.
Well, Don, the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, that you mentioned there, has led Australians in 2 days of solemn remembrance for Queen Elizabeth II, who, of course, served this country as head of state for 7 decades. We've been watching the proclamation ceremony there for King Charles III. Australia will have its own version of that tomorrow morning when King Charles will officially become head of state here in Australia. That's not without its controversies. There's a growing Republican movement here in Australia which believes that an Australian should hold that role as head of state. It's an issue that Queen Elizabeth II had to deal with. In 1999, there was a referendum asking Australians this question, and overwhelmingly they voted to keep the Queen as the head of state. But it's an issue that King Charles III will have to deal with throughout his reign. For now, though, Don, there is a solemn feeling here in Australia as people remember the life of service that Queen Elizabeth gave them, Don. That's right, Michael. Almost every Australian has an opinion on this, whether the British monarch should continue as Australia's head of state or whether that role should be filled by an Australian. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, as you say, is of that opinion that Australia should become a republic and has even charged one of his members of parliament to look into Australia's constitutional future. But Michael, you only have to look at the Republican movement here to get a sense of just how respected Queen Elizabeth II was. There was a referendum on the topic in 1999, and Australians overwhelmingly voted to keep the Queen. The Republican movement said it would continue to pursue its goal, but it wouldn't push for another vote until after Queen Elizabeth II had ended her reign. Now, Michael, so Australians have really put that politics aside today as they've mourned the loss of their head of state, who of course served them for over 70 years. The Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, led them in that morning with an early morning televised address. Here's some of what he had to say.
There is comfort to be found in Her Majesty's own words.
Now, Michael, you heard there the Prime Minister reference a 1954 trip that the Queen made here to Australia, becoming the first British monarch, the first Australian head of state to set foot on Australian soil. Some 70% of Australians came out to greet her that year, to catch a glimpse of Her Majesty, a trip which really set up the foundations for a relationship between the Queen and Australia, which flourished throughout her reign, Michael.
Yeah, remarkable. 16 visits to Australia over the years.
Of Queen Elizabeth II. What is the mood and atmosphere there?
Well, Becky, as you mentioned, Australia has this relationship with the monarchy that's been controversial over the years. There was a referendum in 1999 asking Australians whether they wanted to keep the Queen as the head of state or whether they wanted to put an Australian in that role. And Becky, Australians overwhelmingly voted to keep the Queen. There was some confusion, of course, as to what the system of government would be like after the constitutional monarchy was changed here in Australia. But those politics have been put to one side here by Australians who have really come forward with tributes to a life of service that the Queen exhibited, a life of service to places across the Commonwealth and here in Australia's 70 years as head of state. So you saw that stunning tribute on the Opera House sails last night. That's been followed up here in Sydney this morning by hundreds of mourners coming here to the front gates of Government House, the home of the monarch's representative here in Sydney, and laying flowers, pictures of the Queen and tributes to her, thanking her for that life of service. Now, they've done that despite a request from Buckingham Palace for Australians to consider donating to charity instead of a floral tribute for Her Majesty. The Queen, of course, was a patron of dozens of charities here in Australia, as she was for hundreds around the world, and she even dipped into her own pocket to make personal donations in times of strife here in Australia, supporting bushfire relief funds, flood relief funds, tropical cyclone relief funds, and things like that. Now, the Prime Minister also laid a floral wreath at Parliament House in Canberra this morning at a ceremony which invited dignitaries from the diplomatic corps as well. The Prime Minister will travel to London this week to attend the funeral of Her Majesty. Parliament here in Australia was due to sit. That will be cancelled as the nation mourns. Becky.